tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. For the last few weeks, my Thursday live streams, I've been doing Abhidhamma. And this Thursday I did the cognitive series. And judging by the questions that came up afterwards, there was a lot of interest in one particular aspect of that, which is to do with rebirth and the Bhavanga consciousness. So I thought I'd kind of expand on that topic today and talk about rebirth, the explanations given in both the suttas and the Abhidhamma. First of all, to start with the general picture of karma and rebirth in the suttas, it's emphasized many times by the Buddha how the repeated process of birth and death is very burdensome. It's the essential existential dilemma. I think a lot of people who were raised in Buddhist cultures, they intuitively understand that. They grew up with it. But I think for a lot of Westerners, they kind of miss the point at first, and they hear about rebirth, and it sounds like something positive to them. Oh, I get another run at the game again. There's a series of short suttas where the Buddha is emphasizing this point with some powerful metaphors. For example, he said, if you could pile up all the skulls you've left behind in your previous births, it would make a pile higher than the Himalaya mountains. If you could gather all the tears that you've shed over your lifetimes at the loss of loved ones, it would be a greater body of water than the oceans. And so on. There's many of these similes on the same theme. And at the end of each simile, he says, you should think, enough. How much longer am I going to be filling the cemeteries? So when the cycle of samsara is considered in this way, and the vastness of it, the great extension of time, the billions upon billions of lifetimes, this should encourage a feeling of renunciation and a feeling of nibbida, disenchantment. Enough of this. The Pali is alang for enough. It's alang, which is actually somewhat stronger than our English enough. Enough, be done with it. Maybe it's something like the Italian basta. You know that word? Basta. In Italian, when someone's really fed up with something, it's like basta. Along is kind of like that. So there's this big picture of samsara as being repetitive and ultimately futile, that all our experiences and all our adventures and all our struggles in the big picture is meaningless. It's all been done before. There's nothing new to be experienced or seen. And this is also reinforced by a contemplation of the extreme rarity of a human rebirth. In the whole cycle of rebirth, to be born human is extremely rare and fortunate. And there's the simile of the blind turtle at the bottom of the ocean. And once every 100 years he comes up to the surface, And somewhere in that vast ocean there's floating a yolk. And if he puts his head through the yolk, that's the chance you have of being born human if you've ever fallen into the lower realms. And the station of rebirth, the jati type of rebirth a being takes, is dependent on their karma. And it's much easier to take a rebirth in a lower realm than it is into the human or higher. The number of beings in each successive higher realm becomes less. You can think, even just disregarding for the moment any invisible realms, you just think of the animal realm on this planet, the number of beings born into an insect existence is many, many magnitudes more than human beings. You can just think of the number of mosquitoes there is in a few acres of land. And then think of all the tiny creatures in the soil and in the water and the oceans. The number of beings born into the lower realms is incredibly vast. You know? If a being is born into the human realm, it's as a result of having established the three wholesome roots in a previous lifetime. That is non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion, as predominant over the unwholesome roots of greed, hatred, and delusion. It's also could be regarded as a result of keeping good sila, of keeping the precepts. One who succumbs to the unwholesome root of dosa, that is anger, hatred, ill will in general, they'll tend to be reborn into the hell realm. If they succumb to the root of greed, desire, attachment, then they'll tend to be reborn in the ghost realm. And if they are dominated by the root of moha or delusion, they can be reborn in the animal realm. Then even taking just the human birth, there's a wide range of more or less fortunate births within the human realm. Beings differ in all kinds of capacities in their health and longevity, their intelligence and strength, their beauty. They can be born into wealth or into poverty. There's endless variety. No two beings are going to be exactly alike. And all this is a result of karma made in previous lifetimes. The most fortunate of human birth is to be reborn in fortunate circumstances in a time and place where the Buddha's teaching are heard, and that one has the opportunity and also the capacity to hear and understand the teachings. This is the most fortunate kind of human birth. So in terms of karma, the fact that you are here today listening to a Dhamma talk in the human form is already like winning the lottery. It's the extremely rare state of existence, and as a result of previous good karma that has been made. There's one sutta where it talks about the different particular characteristics that vary amongst humans and how they are a result of karma. And it said, for example, that intelligence is a result of having taken interest in the Dhamma in previous lifetimes, studying and asking questions. If one neglects to take an interest in Dhamma, then one is born with low intelligence. And to be born into wealth is the result of having been generous in previous lifetimes. And being born into poverty is a result of having been stingy. Being born with a beautiful form is a result of having a kindly disposition. And if one has an angry, irascible disposition, then they'll be born ugly. So in general, when the suttas talk about karma and rebirth, it tends to be in this broad application, what kind of a rebirth you're going to take, not dealing with specific, anything more specific than that. And in terms of the mechanism of rebirth, the first question that always comes up is, what is reborn? And this is indeed a question that at least goes at least as far back as the Malinda Panya. And if I was ever to compile a frequently asked questions list, that would be right at the top, would be, how can Buddhism teach not self and rebirth? Isn't there a contradiction? The Buddha was quite clear that there is actually nothing that moves from lifetime to lifetime. And he chastised one monk who said that. He said, "Foolish man, this is not the teaching of the Buddha." This monk had said that this consciousness, and he's using the Pali Vijnana, this consciousness that exists here, this is the same consciousness that re-arises there. The opposition of the Buddha to this idea is essentially based on the teaching of emptiness, of voidness. There's no substantial entity that continues even from moment to moment in one life. This is the anatta, not self doctrine, which was formulated specifically in opposition to the common view of rebirth or reincarnation in other Indian schools. And it should be said, not all Indians at the time held that there was rebirth. There were other positions, but it was a very common position in different schools in India that there was some kind of reincarnation or rebirth. And the general way this was explained was an Atman, or a soul or a spirit, that is unchanging, that everybody has this essential essence, Atman, that moves from life to life. The Bhagavad Gita says it's like a man going to bed at night, and then he wakes up in the morning and he puts on a fresh suit of clothes. The Atman puts on a new body and continues. And Atman in Pali is Atta, in Sanskrit is Atman, so it's the Buddha's answer to this was Anatman or Anatta, not self. No, there is no Atta that continues from life to life. In fact, you won't find an Atta in one life, in moment to moment. There's only an ongoing process. This is the rejection of substantialism, a rejection of an essence. But another foundation of Buddhist teaching is the idea of causality, as in a dependent origination. Because this arises, that comes to be. Because this ceases, that ceases to exist. That things do not arise randomly or arbitrarily. They're linked by cause and effect. So there's a chain of cause and effect that produces the illusion of continuity, that we perceive change to be gradual. We perceive things to persist because subsequent moments will resemble each other because of cause and effect. And rebirth is driven by the impulse of the mind to take an object by desire. And this is present until one reaches arahantship and ignorance is made an end of. In each moment there's a desire to take an object, and the object that arises is determined by kama. So these are the two factors, is outstanding kama and the forward-looking desire that drive the mind through the life. And then at the end of life, when this body dies, the mind in the next moment still has desire. At the last moment it still has desire, and there's still kama that will generate an object. So the only thing that's different is that now it arises somewhere else in another form. The actual process or mechanism in the Theravada Suttas is left somewhat undefined. There is a passage in the Majjhima Nikaya. It occurs in a couple of places that talks about the process of the birth, which really means in Buddhist scriptures, when they talk about birth, they usually really mean conception as the start of a new continuity. The birth of the being occurs when three elements come together, which is the seed of the father, the blood of the mother in her time, and the Gandhabba seeking rebirth. This is a very odd phrase that's actually produced a lot of discussion. There's been papers and books written to try and decipher what this means, because even the commentaries don't really tell us much more about what is meant here. The choice of the word Gandhabba is an odd one. The other use of the word Gandhabba is in the heaven worlds. There's a class of beings that are called Gandhabas. They're the musicians. It's a low class of devas. They're like the male equivalents of the acharas, the dancing girls. So they're kind of the lowest grade of devas. So if you just have enough good merit to be reborn in the deva realm, but just barely enough, you get in as an entertainer. But that doesn't really seem to have a close relation to the Gandhabba here. And then there's yet a third use of the term Gandhabba that occurs in the Samyutta Nikaya. There's a Gandhabba Samyutta talking about Gandhabas, and it seems like a third entirely different use of the word. It says that the Gandhabas travel about, they're little beings that travel about and feed on scents, because Gandha is scent or odor, smell. And the Gandhabas feed on the scent of flowers, they feed on the scent of tree bark. So there's some kind of little forest beings that feed on odors. They're not mentioned in that regard anywhere else, just in this one short passage. In the Abhidhamma Kosha, which is a Sarvastivadin work, there is a kind of an attempt to bring some of these meanings together, and they hold that when a being dies, uh, he turns into a Gandhabba, as the little being that flits around and lives on sense and travels to the place of his rebirth, the new location. And when he gets there, or when it gets there, I should say, because at this point it's not gendered. When it gets to the place of rebirth, it sees and this is assuming a human birth, it sees the parents copulating, and if it feels attraction to the male, it becomes reborn as a female, and if it feels attraction to the female, it becomes reborn as a male. The commentary in the Theravada text in the Majjhima specifically rejects this idea. It says that it should not think of the Gandhabba as a being that stands watching the parents. So commentators who were aware of this interpretation and rejected it. So all this really brings us nowhere. I just thought it's worth pointing out this kind of oddity in the explanation. There is in what one might call common or folk Buddhism in Theravada countries, there's often an idea that, I know in Thailand, there's the idea that when people die, they almost always become a ghost. And it might be just for a short time, if they're fortunate, and then they'll take a proper, like a human birth. But they'll have a transition period as a ghost. And I've heard that, at least in some parts of Burma, they think that people become birds as a transition. So this is kind of bringing back the Gandhabba as a little being that flits around, but in a little more corporeal form. So all this that I've said so far is based on the sutta explanations, and you can see that it leaves a lot of room for interpretation and is kind of undefined in some points. When we turn to the Abhidhamma, one of the characteristics of the Abhidhamma is to try and be very technical and precise. And to begin with, it's specifically stated in the Abhidhamma that the death moment is immediately followed by the birth moment. So there is no transitional state. So this is another point of controversy that sometimes comes up. There's some dispute over whether there is an antarabhava, that's an intermediate state in Theravada. Some of these sutta references would seem to indicate there's some kind of intermission, but the Abhidhamma denies this. It says there's just the death moment, and that's followed by the birth moment immediately. And the passage from one life to another is described in some precision here in the Abhidhamma. As a kind of preliminary, I have to explain the idea of bhavanga consciousness. There is an Abhidhamma concept called the bhavanga, and this you'll find sometimes used by Thai forest ajahns, but in the Thai usage it's not strictly according to the Abhidhamma. The Thai use of bhavanga often just means a dull state in meditation, but this is not the way the Abhidhamma defines it. The idea in the Abhidhamma is that we alternate between two basic modes of consciousness. One is bhavanga, which is mind that's in an idle state. So it's sometimes translated as life continuum consciousness. It's like when you start your car, but it's in park or neutral. It's just sitting there with the engine turning over. It's not going anywhere, doing anything. And then when you put it in gear, the other form of consciousness, which is the cognitive series, when you're actively taking an object. And bhavanga consciousness continues uninterrupted during deep sleep. It's the natural state of deep sleep. And during the day, you're in and out of bhavanga consciousness between moments of perception. And if you're wide awake, alert, bright, and keen, the bhavanga period will be short. You'll be in and out. You'll be taking objects all the time and processing them. But if you're dull and sleepy and not very alert at that moment, then there'll be longer periods of bhavanga intervening. Now, bhavanga is not the mind turned off. It's idling in neutral. And it's a characteristic of consciousness that consciousness always takes an object. So bhavanga takes an object as well. And this is where the connection to rebirth comes in. Because at the moment of death, at the end of one life cycle, the last active moments of consciousness will determine the bhavanga for the next lifetime. And the mind at death will take as its object, in one of three modes, sign of karma, or sign of destiny. Karma and sign of karma are very close, not much difference, and they're backward looking. That's the mind taking some important theme of that previous lifetime, what you've done in that lifetime, your action, your karma, either a heavy action, a very significant action, or a repeated habitual action. And it will either alight on the action itself or on some symbolic sign of the action. Sign of destiny is the mind looking forward to the next lifetime. And the examples given in the Visuddhimagga is one who is going to be reborn in hell might see flames or swords. One who's going to be reborn in the heaven realm might see beautiful flowers or hear beautiful music. And that object taken at that moment then fixes the bhavanga for the following lifetime. So this is how the link between lifetimes works, that your entire lifetime, one entire lifetime, you spend a great many psychic moments in bhavanga, and whenever you're in bhavanga, you're taking that single solitary object that was fixed at the moment of death of the previous life. So it kind of sets the theme of which our ordinary waking consciousness is really unconscious of, because you don't remember when you're in the cognitive series mode, when you're taking an object and you're what we would say conscious or awake, you don't remember the bhavanga object. And the fact that you're in a human form means that you took a fortunate bhavanga object in your previous death. If you take an unfortunate one, an unpleasant one, you would have taken a lower rebirth. So as a human being, you can be sure your bhavanga consciousness is something on the pleasant side of neutral. So this works from lifetime to lifetime. And in this life, currently, you're making karma, you're building up conditions, so that when the moment of death comes, the mind will run over the experiences of this life and settle on some theme that will be the contribution of this life to the next life. And the next life will begin and carry on making new karma in that condition. It's not really explained or talked about in Abhidhamma, but going back to suttas and commentaries, we could say, though, that this bhavanga object is not the only thing that we inherit from a previous lifetime. There are a wide range of characteristics that are developed over lifetimes and carry forward. The paramis, for example, are said to be something that survives, the values of the paramis that will contribute to establishing a position in the next life. So the paramis are like faith and endurance and wisdom. There's 10 paramis, and these positive spiritual qualities that are built up and carry over from one lifetime to another. There's also anusayas, which are underlying tendencies. And these can be positive or negative or neutral. They're just things that carry on. And I think you can see that in people, in anusayas, that people have characteristic ways of being that it's hard to account for in their life experience. One kind of eccentric example in the suttas is Sariputta, the Buddha's monk, chief disciple, who was his wisest monk. When they were out on alms round one time, it was after a rainfall, and every time they came to a puddle of water, all the rest of the monks would walk around the puddle, but Sariputta would jump over the puddle with his 2 feet together. And one of the junior monks thought this was unseemly behavior, and he reported it to the Buddha. And the Buddha said, "Oh, that's nothing, never mind that. That's just this anusaya. It's his habit, because at one time Sariputta spent 500 lifetimes as a monkey." so, old habits are hard to break. This is all part of the continuity of cause and effect. And the last point, I think I'm kind of winding down, the last point I'd like to make is in our attitude towards karma and rebirth, it's really of not much value to speculate and wonder, what was I in the past, where was I, what did I do? This is not very fruitful, because there's nothing you can do about it. It's in the past. It's dead and done. You're living the results of it. But what should concern you is, what kind of a karma are you setting up for future lifetimes? And to think of this lifetime at some point will be a past lifetime. And what contributions have you made when you come around another time? Are you setting good conditions for fortunate rebirth and positive paramis and anusayas? Because you're going to have to experience that. So sometimes it's a good contemplation to think of this life as a past life. Like, what are the themes of this life that are contributing to your karmic heritage going forward?